sound of metal striking concrete cut through the silence like a blade. It was small, barely more than a clink, but in a room where every breath had weight, it stopped Elena cold. The bullet rolled off the inspection table in a slow, indifferent arc, and came to rest against the base of a supply crate, wobbling once before going still. She stared at it, not because she hadn't seen a bullet drop before, but because this one had come out of the box marked with her call sign. She crouched, picked it up between two fingers, and held it under the beam of her headlamp. There it was, a hairline groove around the neck of the round, too precise to be accidental, too subtle to catch without knowing what to look for, just enough to compromise the casing under the pressure of firing, just enough to make the rifle explode in her hands at the worst possible moment. Outside the armory's corrugated steel walls, the city of Vorsk lay buried under half a meter of new snow, and somewhere in that white silence, a team of 6 operators was pulling on their gear, checking their radios, and counting down the minutes until midnight. The city had not always been silent. There had been a time not so long ago, though it felt like another century, when Vorsk had nearly 500,000 people, when the market squares ran with voices and engine noise, when the old government quarter was lit every night by amber street lamps that made the cobblestones shine like wet copper. That time was over. 2 decades of civil war had done what wars do to cities: stripped them to the bone, expelled the living, and left only architecture as a record of what had existed. The apartment blocks still stood, most of them, their facades pocked with shrapnel scars and their interiors gutted by fire or looting or both. The grand post office on the central plaza had collapsed inward on itself, its copper dome now a heap of oxidized rubble that snow covered with the same indifference it covered everything else. Power lines ran nowhere, pipes connected to nothing. The only electricity in the city came from 4 diesel generators humming inside the temporary forward operating base that the coalition forces had established in a converted warehouse on the eastern edge of the commercial district. That was where Elena Reeves had spent the last 11 days waiting for the mission to materialize. Elena Reeves was 34 years old and had been a precision marksman for 9 of those years. She had earned her reputation not through volume of engagements, but through the specific, documented quality of her work in conditions that broke other operators. Mountain ops at over 3,000 meters. Night engagements in driving rain, a confirmed shot at just under 1,400 meters through a partially obstructed line of sight during a typhoon watch in the South China Sea corridor. She was not the loudest person in any room, and she was never the most immediately commanding. What she had instead was a kind of focused stillness that people noticed without being able to articulate. She moved through spaces, vehicles, command posts, forward positions, as though she had already mentally mapped every exit and calculated every angle before she entered. Those who had served beside her long enough understood that this was not affectation. It was a survival mechanism that had calcified into personality. Elena Reeves had grown up in a family that the war had taken from her one piece at a time. First her father to a roadside bomb, then her younger brother to an illness that would have been treatable in any hospital that still had medicine, and finally her mother to the particular kind of despair that doesn't require violence to be fatal. She had joined the military at 19 not out of ideology, but because it was the one structure left in a world that had removed all the others. The rifle had become the instrument through which she had learned to make sense of chaos. Aim, exhale, squeeze, outcome, cause and effect, cleanly rendered, in a world where nothing else was clean. The team assembled for this operation was not the kind that appeared on official rosters. They operated under a task force designation that existed in 3 separate classified databases and nowhere else. Their commander was a man named Daniel Mason, 41, former Ranger Battalion, face like weathered stone and a voice that rarely exceeded conversational volume but carried a weight that made people listen. Mason had run operations in 6 different conflict zones, and the thing that distinguished him from other commanders was not his tactical record, impressive as it was, but his capacity to stay methodical when the situation was deteriorating. He did not panic. He adapted. Running beside him was James Carter, the team's demolition specialist, younger by 8 years, built low and wide, quick with dark humor in the way that people who have been genuinely frightened many times often are. Carter's expertise was in breaching, locked doors, reinforced gates, perimeter walls. He read structures the way Elena read distances. The third person of note in their orbit that night was not a field operator at all. His name was Raymond Urey, and he ran the armory. Urey was 56 and walked with a slight hitch in his left hip from a fragment that had never been fully removed. He had been an armorer for 30 years, First in conventional military service and then for this kind of work. The work that didn't get written about. He treated weapons the way a master clockmaker treats movements, with patience, with respect, and with a precision that was almost devotional. When he had pulled Elena aside 90 minutes before 0 hour and told her to run a secondary inspection on her dedicated sniper ammunition, he had done it quietly, with the particular tone of a man who has learned to trust his instincts even when he cannot yet name what they're telling him. Something felt wrong, he had said. She had not argued. Now she knew exactly what he had felt. The intelligence picture for the Vorsk operation had never been clean. The target was the former Ministry of Infrastructure building 6 stories of brutalist concrete in the center of the government quarter, where a splinter faction of the insurgency was reportedly holding 3 civilians, one of whom was a logistics contractor with access to information the coalition badly needed. The faction's leadership was believed to be rotating the hostages to a secondary location at 0100 hours, which meant the window for extraction was narrow. Mason had flagged the intelligence reliability as moderate at best. The source was 2 steps removed, the imagery was 72 hours old, and the radio intercepts had gone dark in the last 18 hours, which could mean nothing or could mean the opposition had changed frequencies, precisely because they knew someone was listening. The team had wargamed 3 variants of the approach. They had rehearsed the breach pattern twice on a rough floor layout drawn in chalk on the warehouse concrete. They were as ready as the information allowed them to be. And then Yuri had pulled Elena aside. She laid the round on the inspection table and picked up the next one from the box. Same groove, same location. She worked through the entire box in 4 minutes precise, methodical, no wasted motion, and by the end she had separated 11 compromised rounds from 9 that appeared clean. Yuri stood at her shoulder, silent, his breath fogging in the cold air of the unheated armory. When she looked up at him, his face had gone the color of old cement. He had been doing this for 30 years and had never seen deliberate sabotage in a controlled supply environment. The implication was not abstract. If she had gone into that building and pulled the trigger on one of those rounds, the barrel would have fragmented under the overpressure of a compromised casing. The rifle would have become shrapnel. The hand holding it would have become worse. Whoever did this knew which box was yours, Yuri said. He did not say it as accusation. He said it as pure, quiet fact, which was more frightening than any accusation. Elena set down the last round. She looked at the 9 she had cleared. 9 rounds was workable. It was not comfortable, but it was workable. She thought about the hostages. She thought about the 1 o'clock movement. She thought about what happened to intelligence assets when the people coming to extract them didn't show up. "We're not aborting," she said. Yuri nodded once. He had not expected any other answer. He loaded the 9 clean rounds into a separate carrier, pocketed it, and began breaking down the compromised ammunition with the methodical calm of someone who has already made the hard decision and moved past it. She had 12 minutes. She used 11 of them. Mason was standing at the mission board when she found him, stylus in hand, running through the approach corridor one more time with Carter. She told him about the rounds in 6 sentences. He listened without interrupting. Then he put down the stylus, very carefully, and was quiet for 3 seconds. "The mission proceeds," he said. "Anything else?" She told him what Yuri had said about the box, about the specificity of what had been targeted. Mason's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We'll sort the rest after," he said. It was the wrong answer, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so out loud. There was no time for the right answer. Carter, who had been listening from the far end of the table, caught Elena's eye for one brief moment. In that moment, everything either of them didn't say hung visible in the cold air between them. They moved out at 11:47. 6 operators in 3 pairs, spreading through the streets of Vorsk in a loose pattern designed to make them difficult to count from a fixed observation point. The city received them the way abandoned cities receive everything. In silence, snow-muffled footfalls and distance alike. Buildings that had once been offices and apartments loomed on either side, their windows dark except for the occasional pale shimmer of moonlight caught in a shard of remaining glass. Elena moved in the second pair, flanking Mason, her rifle slung and her sidearm out. The temperature had dropped another 3 degrees since they had left the forward operating base, and the wind had picked up from the northwest, driving snow horizontally through the narrower streets and reducing visibility at any real distance to a gauzy gray wall of white. She kept her breathing even. She cataloged what she could see. She filed what she couldn't into a mental space she kept at the back of her awareness, the space for things that hadn't happened yet but might. She had noticed it before they'd crossed the first intersection. A sensation rather than a data point. The feeling of being observed from a fixed position. It was not a new sensation for her. She had felt it in the mountains, in the rubble belts, in the jungle approaches of operations that had nothing in common with this one except the fundamental structure of being in a place where other people wanted you dead. Instinct was not magic. It was pattern recognition working faster than conscious analysis. Something about the distribution of shadows in the upper floors of a building 3 blocks to the northeast did not match the wind and the ambient light the way it should have. She filed it. She kept moving, harder, walking 20 meters ahead with the lead element, slowed without signaling. He crouched, looked at something in the snow at his feet, then held up a closed fist. They stopped. He beckoned Elena forward with 2 fingers. She moved up, and he pointed without touching the ground. Boot prints. Single set, recent enough that the edges were still crisp despite the wind, which meant they had been made in the last 40 minutes. The tread was military. The stride length was long. Whoever had made them had been moving purposefully, not wandering. Moving from the direction of the government quarter back toward the northern residential blocks. Mason came up beside them, looked at the prints, said nothing. He touched the radio at his collar. Yuri's voice came back in his earpiece, distant, slightly fragmented by the cold and the distance, but clear enough. The radio relays in Vorsk were improvised and unreliable. They all knew that if the situation deteriorated quickly, communication would be the first thing that failed. Elena turned and looked back at the building to the northeast. The shadow she had noticed was no longer there, which told her everything she needed to know. A shadow in the right position and then gone is not the wind. The wind does not retreat with that kind of deliberate economy. Someone had been watching the street, seen the team stop, and pulled back precisely far enough to avoid being caught with a scope. That took training. That took patience. That took the specific kind of discipline that only gets built through repetition in conditions like these: cold, dark, high stakes. The understanding that one impatient movement makes all the difference. She filed the location. She filed the floor. She kept moving. The next 2 blocks were the worst part of the approach. The street narrowed as it entered what had been the commercial heart of the city's eastern district, where shop fronts and small office buildings pressed close on both sides, and the intersections created natural choke points that any half-competent defender would have pre-designated as kill zones. The team moved through them quickly, using window frames for cover, crossing the open ground in 2-second sprints with the others providing observation. The wind had dropped slightly, but the snow had gotten heavier, which was a trade Elena would have taken on any other night because it cut visibility in both directions equally. But tonight the disadvantage of not seeing clearly was one she could not fully offset, while the advantage of not being seen clearly was one the opposition apparently did not need, because they already knew where the team was going. She called it before she had time to think about it. One word, flat and immediate, into the team channel: sniper. The lead pair broke left into a doorway. Mason and Elena went right. The shot didn't come, which was sometimes worse, because it meant the other shooter was patient. A sniper who fires immediately is working on a timeline of their own, and may have other concerns. A sniper who holds is a sniper who has chosen their moment and is waiting for it, which means they are in control of the encounter in a way that the target cannot fully offset. Elena had been in both kinds of situations. She preferred the ones where the shot came, because at least then she had a muzzle flash to work from. Elena moved to the upper floor of the nearest intact structure, a 3-story building that had been a small hotel, its lobby floor still bearing the ghost of a tile pattern under a layer of plaster dust and debris, and found a window facing northeast with a clear sightline to the building where she had seen the shadow shift. She went to the floor, spread her bipod in the debris, and settled into position. The wind was coming from her left at approximately 12 kilometers per hour. The distance to the building was roughly 380 meters. She estimated the floor she was watching third from the top and began working the scope across the windows one at a time. She found him in the third window. Not all of him. A configuration, the angle of a scope, the slight protrusion of a barrel, the geometry of a person doing exactly what she was doing and doing it well. He was motionless. He was watching the street below where the rest of the team was pinned. He had not yet acquired her. She had perhaps 4 seconds of advantage. She settled her crosshairs on the configuration, managed her breathing into 2 slow cycles, and on the exhale of the second, she pressed the trigger. The rifle spoke once. Clean. The configuration in the window ceased to be a configuration and became an absence. She stayed on the glass for 3 seconds, watching. Nothing moved. Clear, she said into the channel. They began to move again. She had 8 rounds left. They were within 200 meters of the government quarter when the mine went off. It was a pressure plate device, likely placed in the debris field under the snow during the preceding 12 hours, which meant whoever had planted it had known or strongly suspected the approach corridor the team would use. The blast radius was modest, but the placement was precise, directly under the spot where Carter had been walking. The explosion knocked him backward and down, and when Elena reached him, he was conscious but bleeding badly from a wound below the right knee where a fragment had punched through his lower leg. He was already working to control it himself, tourniquet from his own kit, applied with the practiced efficiency of someone who had put tourniquets on other people often enough to do it perfectly on himself. She helped him tighten it. He gritted his teeth and made no sound that could be heard at any distance. When she looked up at Mason, she saw the same thought forming in his face that had formed in hers. The sniper, the prince, the mine on the approach route. Someone knew where they were going and had prepared for them specifically. Mason keyed his radio. He asked Yuri if anyone had left the FOB since the mission briefing. The static held for 2 seconds. Then Yuri's voice came back, careful and flat. Checking. Mason did not look at Elena. Elena did not look at Mason. A transmission broke over their internal frequency. Not Yuri. Not their command channel. Something else, a voice using their encryption, speaking without introduction, calm as reading weather. A single sentence in a register so level it took a moment to register as a threat. Then the frequency went dead. They pulled into the old city library on the northeast corner of the main plaza, a heavy stone building with walls thick enough to stop most small arms fire and intact enough to provide cover from the wind. Carter was mobile but slow. Mason posted 2 operators on the windows while Elena and Mason moved to the rear room, where Yuri's voice came back on the radio, stronger now, with information that had the texture of something that had been dreaded before it was confirmed. There was a device in Carter's equipment, a small radio transmitter, roughly the size of a coin battery with a thin antenna, threaded through the lining of his pack at the bottom seam. It was not the kind of thing a person placed on themselves. It was the kind of thing that got placed on someone without their knowledge, during a moment when their gear was unattended, or by a hand they trusted without question. Carter sat against the wall and held the device up in the low light of a chemstick, turning it in his fingers with an expression that was somewhere between furious and hollow. Mason told them then not everything, but enough. There had been intelligence for several months suggesting a penetration in their network. Not a hypothesis. A documented concern, elevated to high confidence after 2 prior operations had unraveled in ways that could not be explained by operational security failures alone. The internal designation for the suspected penetration was a word that translated loosely as ghost, an asset embedded so thoroughly that they moved in the spaces between verification and suspicion. The transmitter in Carter's pack meant the ghost had been close enough to handle his gear, close enough to be inside the team's physical perimeter. Possibly inside it still. Elena held her rifle and looked at the wall and thought about the compromised ammunition. She thought about what Yuri had said. The person who had done it knew exactly which box was hers. She thought about who had access to the armory log. She thought about who had been present at the final briefing where the specific ammunition assignment had been confirmed. She kept arriving at the same name, and each time she arrived there she set it aside and tried to find another route. There were no other routes. She keyed her radio and told Yuri what she was thinking without naming it directly. Yuri was quiet for longer than usual. Then he told her that the armory access log showed a single unscheduled entry in the 4 hours prior to mission staging. The timestamp placed it after midnight briefing and before Yuri's own arrival to prep the equipment. The access card used was Mason's. The temperature in the library felt like it dropped 5 degrees. Elena did not look at Mason. She looked at the wall, and then at the transmitter still sitting in Carter's palm, and then at the door, where the wind was finding its way through cracks in the stone. Mason's voice came before she could form a sentence. He had heard Yuri too, same channel, same clarity. He spoke without raising his voice. He explained what he had done. 3 days prior, working on his own initiative after reviewing the ghost intelligence, he had entered the armory after hours to retrieve a secondary equipment cache. He had pre-positioned as a contingency if the primary loadout was compromised during staging. He had not logged it through official channels because the contingency plan itself was compartmented. He had not touched the sniper ammunition. He had not known Elena's specific ammunition allocation. Carter said nothing. He looked at Mason with the careful, flat expression of a man deciding whether to believe something he wanted to believe. Elena looked at Mason directly for the first time since Yuri had spoken. She was trained to read the physical tells of deception, the micro-expressions, the breath patterns, the eye movements that didn't track with words. She read Mason now. He held her gaze without flinching. He breathed at normal rate. He did not look away or to the left. She thought about the fact that a skilled liar would know exactly how to mimic those tells. And she thought about the fact that she had served with Mason for 4 years, and she thought about the fact that neither of those things was proof of anything in either direction. Then she felt it, at the base of her left hip, in the small exterior pocket of her vest, where she kept things she never needed to access during a mission, the pocket she hadn't opened since she'd staged her kit that morning. She reached in, her fingers found a cartridge. She pulled it out and held it up. It was one of the compromised rounds the head stamp told her immediately. She had not put it there. She had never put it there, someone had. Before anyone else could speak, the loudspeaker mounted on a vehicle somewhere in the plaza beyond the library's thick walls crackled to life. The voice that came through it was amplified and slightly distorted but entirely intelligible. It said her name, her full name, and then the call sign she had used in her last unit, a name that had been classified, that existed in no document she had ever seen circulate outside a single compartmented program that had officially ended 3 years ago. The voice asked her to come outside. The insurgents hit the library from 2 sides simultaneously. The windows took fire, first sustained automatic weapons, professional spacing between shooters, coordinated enough to suggest prior rehearsal. The 2 operators on the windows went flat and returned fire. Disciplined, no panic. Mason was already moving, directing the response before the second burst had finished. Elena went up the internal stairs to the first-floor landing, found a window on the north face with an oblique angle to the plaza, and began working the targets she could identify in the dark and snow. She was counting rounds with the part of her mind that always counted rounds. The library's stone walls absorbed the incoming fire with the stolid indifference of masonry built in an era when permanence was still a design objective, but glass was glass regardless of the century, and within the first 90 seconds every window on the ground floor had been shot out, which meant the cold came fully inside and the wind with it, and the sound of the firefight stopped being muffled and became open and immediate and total. She fired twice from the north window. She moved before returning to the same position. She found a second angle from the stairwell itself, half a step down from the landing, where a gap in the plaster let her see a section of the plaza that the windows couldn't cover. She used it. She moved again. Carter used the last thing he had left to give. 60 seconds and a charge of demolition explosive that he had been carrying since the FOB, applied to a collapsed section of the library's rear wall, blowing through the rubble to create an exit into the alley behind the building. The blast was contained and precise. Carter had always been precise, even working with one functional leg and a tourniquet biting into what was left of his circulation. When the wall came in, the rush of cold air was violent and immediate. A pressure wave that knocked plaster dust into the air in a visible cloud and briefly silenced every sound in the room except the ringing. Carter didn't come through with the others. Elena knew it before Mason confirmed it over the channel. She kept moving. They came through the alley, Mason limping from a round that had caught the outer edge of his left thigh and regrouped in the shadow of a loading dock 2 buildings back from the plaza. Elena checked her carrier. She had 4 rounds of clean ammunition remaining. Mason was losing blood at a manageable rate and refused to stop moving. She looked at the badge patch on the arm of one of the insurgents she had passed in the rubble, a geometric symbol she hadn't expected to see again. She had seen it once, on the shoulder of a unit that had fought alongside her own in the mountains. A unit that had gone dark 4 years ago after an engagement that command had attributed to an ambush but that she had never fully accepted as random. There had been 6 survivors. She had been one of them. As far as the official record was concerned, the others had not been. The radio crackled. Her old call sign again, windless, a word she hadn't heard in 4 years, spoken in a voice that she recognized before she had consciously processed the recognition. The voice of a man named David Cole, who had been her spotter during 3 years of mountain operations, who had been listed as killed in action in the same engagement that had supposedly ended that unit, and whose face she had last seen at a field hospital 200 kilometers from here, 4 years and a lifetime ago. She left Mason at the loading dock with the remaining operator and moved north through the service alleys, following the geometry she had worked out from the sniper's positioning earlier in the night. Cole was moving too. She could feel it in the way the sound environment around her shifted, the way a single figure moving through debris creates its own kind of acoustic signature if you've spent enough hours learning to hear it. She entered a 6-story building that had been a government printing office, cleared the lobby without using her light, and went to the east stairwell. He would be working the upper floors. He always had preferred height. She found him on the 4th floor. Or rather, they found each other in the corridor simultaneously, each appearing at the end of a hallway from opposite stairwells, both stopping at once. There was no shooting. There was a distance of approximately 15 meters between them and a corridor of broken doors and collapsed ceiling tiles, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Cole looked older than she had expected, not aged the way combat aged people, the hollowing of the eyes, the particular compression of the face, but something different. Like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had gotten strong from it rather than broken. He still held his rifle, but the muzzle was angled down. So was hers. He told her what he needed her to know, because there wasn't time for anything else, and he had apparently decided he was past the point of operational pretense. He told her that the ammunition in her sniper box had been tampered with, not to kill her at the moment of firing, but to force a catastrophic failure that would abort the mission. He told her that the ministry building was not a hostage rescue operation. The civilians inside were not intelligence assets. They were witnesses, people who had been present at specific events during the war that certain people very high up in a command structure needed to remain undocumented. The mission brief to the team was a cover. The actual objective, the one that only existed in a classified annex that Mason had never been shown, was to eliminate everyone in that building and ensure that the team itself did not return with any information about what they had found there. The hostage rescue was the story. The operation was a burial. Elena listened. She stood in the corridor with her rifle at low ready, and she listened, and she felt the weight of it settle in her chest like water pouring into a damaged hull, heavy, cold, and filling the spaces between things she had thought she understood. She had known something was wrong. She had not known how wrong. Cole had found out 18 months ago. He had gone underground rather than report it, because he had learned what happened to people who reported it through official channels. He had been trying to stop the operation the only way available to him from outside, with imperfect tools and limited information. The compromised rounds had been his work, delivered through a contact inside the staging base, intended to ground Elena's participation and force an abort. He hadn't expected Yuri to catch it. He hadn't accounted for the possibility that the mission would proceed anyway. "You should have told me," she said. 4 years ago. Whenever you knew." He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has rehearsed his answer to this question many times and never found one he could live with. "I thought I could stop it cleanly," he said. "I was wrong." She didn't say anything else, because there was nothing useful left to say, and because the radio on her hip had just broken into a burst of fragmented transmissions that told her the building where Mason was sheltering had incoming. She ran. Through the stairwell, through the lobby, into the alley, back south along the route she had come. She heard the vehicles before she cleared the last corner, 2, possibly 3, engines running heavy, the kind that carried mounted weapons or more personnel than a normal vehicle. She came around the corner into the alley behind the loading dock and saw what Cole had tried to warn her about. Mason and the remaining operator were still at the dock. Around them, from 3 directions, figures were converging through the snow, too many to count quickly, enough to end it without difficulty. They had not yet closed the last 30 meters slowed by the wreckage and the wind and whatever tactical caution had survived this far into the night. But they were closing. Elena assessed. 4 clean rounds, 1 rifle, approximately 20 degrees of angular coverage from her current position. She did the arithmetic. It was not comfortable mathematics. She picked her first target by threat index, the figure with the mounted weapon system at the southeast, the one that could suppress the dock long enough for the others to rush, and she put her crosshairs on him and exhaled and fired. She worked through the next 3 rounds in 30 seconds, each shot placed for maximum disruption rather than confirmed elimination. The goal being not to win a firefight with 4 rounds against 20 plus, but to break the geometry of it long enough to change what was possible. It worked. Not cleanly. Not without cost. But the approaching lines broke and scattered, and in the window that created, the remaining operator got Mason moving, and they went north through the gap Elena had made. She was empty. She ejected the carrier, pocketed it from habit, and went to her sidearm. She heard a round hit the wall beside her. At the same moment she heard Mason's voice over the radio saying the name she had hoped not to hear, Carter's, in the past tense, confirming what she already knew. Then Mason's voice stopped. Not because of the radio. She could hear his voice still, faintly, without the radio, from somewhere ahead of her in the dark. Alive, still moving, but the radio had taken a hit. She came out of the alley into the open expanse of the government plaza, and the plaza was white and vast and full of wind, and David Cole was standing in the center of it, 20 meters away, with his rifle raised. He could have shot her from the printing office. He could have shot her from anywhere in the approach, at any of the moments when she had been exposed and moving fast and not watching behind her. He hadn't. She held her empty sniper rifle in her left hand and her sidearm in her right, and she looked at him across 20 meters of white ground, and she understood that this was not an ambush. This was a request. He wanted her to know all of it before the end of the night. He wanted someone to know. She was the only person left who was qualified to understand it and who might still survive long enough to do something with it. "Put the rifle down," she said. He didn't lower it. "I can't let you walk them out," he said. "If Mason files a report, the annex gets buried and the witnesses die in a different way on a different schedule." She stepped left, putting herself at an angle to him, buying 2 seconds of dead time in the geometry. "Mason doesn't know about the annex," she said. "He never did." Cole held. She could see him processing it, recalibrating the information against what he had believed. In that fraction of a second, she closed 4 meters. He swept the rifle toward her. She put her shoulder down and hit him low, driving him backward into the snow, and the rifle went wide and discharged once into the white sky, and then they were in the snow together, fighting for the weapon, and then neither of them had it. What followed was not clean. It was not cinematic in the way that fighting is sometimes imagined to be. It was cold and hard, and it lasted longer than such things should last because both of them were skilled and both of them were exhausted, and neither of them was willing to finish it in the way that would have been easiest. She ended it with the heel of her palm and a technique she had learned in a close-quarters course in the 3rd year of her service, and Cole went down into the snow and stayed there breathing, conscious, but done. She stood over him. She was breathing hard. Snow was falling into the space between them. "Yuri caught the rounds," she said. He looked up at her from the snow. "I know," he said. "He called it to me through a relay. That's how I knew to move." She absorbed that. She looked at him on the ground and thought about the mountains 4 years ago and the engagement that command had attributed to chance and the 6 survivors who were down to 1. She thought about the thing he had tried to do clumsily, with the wrong tools, at the wrong distance, and years too late, which was nonetheless the same thing she had been trying to do every time she had made a decision that put the mission before herself. Stop the machinery from grinding someone else down. "Get up," she said. "Can you walk?" He tested it. He could. "Where are we going?" he asked. She picked up his rifle and cleared the chamber and handed it back to him. "But first, away from here," she said. "And then you're going to write down everything you know and give it to someone who can't be made to disappear." He looked at the rifle in her hands. He took it. "And Mason?" he said. She turned toward the north side of the plaza, where she could hear the distant sound of an engine that didn't belong to anything she'd heard tonight, something heavier, higher-pitched, rotary. "He's going to need a hospital," she said. The helicopter came in from the east, as the sky was lightening from black to the deep blue-gray of pre-dawn, the rotor wash sending snow spiraling up from the plaza in wide flat circles. It landed on a clear section of the main square, the one that had once been a gathering place for the city's 500,000 residents, where a fountain still stood frozen solid in the January cold, its bronze figures locked mid-motion, reaching for something in the stalled air. The medical personnel who came off the helicopter were quick and efficient. They took Mason. They took the surviving operator. They asked no questions that required long answers. Someone somewhere had made a call, and the call had resulted in this helicopter. And Elena did not know who had made it, and at that particular moment did not want to. She had filed that question into the space at the back of her awareness, the space for things that hadn't happened yet but would need to be addressed, carefully, in a world with better lighting and more time. She stood at the edge of the plaza as the helicopter lifted off, its noise swallowing everything else for 30 seconds, and then it was gone and the city was quiet again. The snow had stopped sometime in the last hour, and the sky to the east had the first faint suggestion of color, a cold rose along the horizon, barely perceptible, the kind of dawn that arrived in winter like an apology rather than a promise. She looked at the plaza, at the fountain, at the buildings that ringed it, their facades still bearing the marks of the war that had emptied the city, the blast patterns and the patched holes and the places where entire floors had been sheared away and replaced by open air, at the snow that covered all of it with the same white indifference that it had covered everything all night. All the tracks, all the debris, all the blood that had gone into it. Yuri's voice came on the radio. He was at the FOB. He had pulled the full armory log and the camera footage from every angle the system still had operational. and he had a sequence of events documented from the 4-hour window before mission staging. He had names, he had timestamps. He had the kind of evidence that didn't require anyone's word as a foundation, the kind that stood on its own in daylight, in any room, in front of anyone. He told Elena he had sent copies through 3 separate encrypted channels before the mission had launched, because he had suspected before the mission had launched that the original copies would not survive the night intact. She thought about Yuri standing alone in that cold armory, making contingency copies of contingency evidence because his instincts told him something was wrong and he had decided to trust his instincts. She thought about what it meant that a man who maintained weapons for a living had been the one to see it clearly when no one else had. "Thank you," she said. Yuri was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Check your equipment before every deployment, Sergeant. Every single time." It was not a lesson. It was not advice. It was what he always said, and it was the truest thing he knew how to say. And she understood that it was the closest he had to everything else he meant. Cole was gone by the time the helicopter had lifted. She had expected that. She had not tried to stop it. She did not know whether the things he had promised to do would get done, or whether the people he would need to tell would be in a position to hear him, or whether the machinery that had built the annexes and buried the witnesses and sent her team into Vorsk with a false objective would prove too large and too embedded to move. She had been in this work long enough to know that those were questions that did not resolve cleanly or quickly or with certainty. What she knew was that Yuri had the documentation. What she knew was that Mason, if he survived the surgery that the medical personnel were presumably already beginning, would have to answer questions that he had not anticipated answering. What she knew was that she was standing in a city full of ruins with 9 spent casings and 1 operational rifle and the knowledge of something that she was now responsible for carrying in the world. She thought about Carter. She had not allowed herself to think about Carter during the fighting because thinking about the dead during a firefight was the fastest way to join them, and the discipline of deferral was one of the first things this kind of work taught you and one of the last things it ever let you unlearn. Carter, who had used dark humor the way other people used armor. Carter, who had read buildings the way she read distances, who had placed a demolition charge with his leg wrapped in a tourniquet, and blown them an exit, and stayed behind to ensure the charge was the last thing he did rather than the second to last. She did not know what she was supposed to do with that. There was no protocol for it. There were after-action reports and casualty notifications and a process that turned people into paperwork with the same efficiency that the war turned cities into rubble, and she had filed enough of those reports to know that they captured almost nothing of what they purported to document. She let the thought sit for a moment, then she filed it into the space at the back of her awareness, where it would wait until she had the time and the stillness to carry it properly. She slung the rifle over her right shoulder and began walking. Not toward the FOB. Not toward any extraction point she had been briefed on. North, toward the edge of the city, where the road out of Vorsk ran between the empty apartment blocks and the overgrown lots and eventually connected to the highway that connected to somewhere else. She walked through the plaza, past the frozen fountain, past the rubble of the old post office, past the tracks that she and the team had made in the snow some hours earlier on the way in, now softened by new snowfall into something between record and memory. The city was entirely quiet. In the hush of the early morning, with the sky going gradually lighter and the cold absolute and the snow undisturbed on every surface that hadn't seen foot traffic in the night, it was almost possible to imagine the 500,000 people who were no longer here to feel their absence as a presence rather than a void. The way that grief eventually becomes not emptiness but weight. She passed a school. She knew it was a school because the sign was still attached to the gatepost, its lettering faded but legible, the kind of institutional typography that governments favored in the era when this building had been constructed. The gate itself was open, or rather it had been forced open at some point and never reattached, and it leaned against the wall at the angle of something that had given up on its original purpose. The schoolyard beyond it was a flat white square. The building's windows were intact on the lower floors and gone on the upper in the pattern that she had come to recognize as a signature of a particular kind of fighting. The fighting that moves floor by floor through a building while the building is still occupied. The kind that the war in Vorsk had apparently included before the city was finally emptied. She did not stop at the gate. She walked past it. She noted it, the way she noted everything, and kept it in the space she reserved for the things she could not process and could not discard. The road north out of the government quarter crossed a bridge over a canal that had frozen solid sometime in the preceding weeks. Below the bridge, the ice was unmarked by anything, no footprints, no debris, No evidence that the world had been at war 12 hours ago in the streets above it. Just a flat gray-white surface running between the canal's stone banks, perfectly still under the brightening sky. She stopped at the center of the bridge for 30 seconds. Not because she heard anything, not because anything required her attention. Just to stand in a place that had nothing in it, no threat assessment, no tactical problem, no decision that needed to be made for 30 seconds. Then she walked on. An old radio unit, still attached to a power source she hadn't seen, crackled once from somewhere in the rubble of a building she was passing. Static. And then, for one clear second before the signal degraded and died completely, a voice not directed at anyone, not anyone she recognized. Just a fragment of transmission from somewhere, from someone, from the ongoing frequency of a world that kept broadcasting regardless of who was left to receive. War never buries its ghosts. The signal went out. The plaza was silent. Elena Reeves walked north, out of the city, into the cold and lightning morning, and the snow behind her covered everything she had left there, and the sky kept brightening the way it always did, indifferent to what had happened beneath it, indifferent to what had been lost and what had been kept and what would now have to be carried forward into whatever came next. Fade out.